Okay, so now we have to be official. We're starting our recording. Switch over here. Okay, so today, there's more people in the, there we go. So today we're going to be talking about UEFI versus BIOS a little bit. And this crosses over between both books because in the software book, it is talking about partitioning, because you'd have to partition to be able to install Windows. And I know we had one person that was trying to install to a laptop that had formerly had Ubuntu on it, or Linux. And Linux uses a slightly different type of formatting, but it's still partitioned with either master boot record or, excuse me, GPT, which we'll talk about in just a second here. So we're still admitting some people from the waiting room here. So, and the other part that goes along with this, so these are two kind of related issues, is the BIOS or UEFI. And I do think it's kind of interesting. They're going to continue calling it a BIOS for quite a while. In fact, I was working on this laptop. I was doing the same thing that one of the students was doing. It had formerly, this laptop used to have Linux on it. I was using Linux Mint. And then I needed to make a flash drive and then boot it off the flash drive to wipe it and install Windows. And when you have to go into the BIOS or into the UEFI to change the boot up options to include USB boot. It wasn't on there by default. On a lot of them it is. You can choose like F12 or one of the setup button. If you see something popping up the screen that says to go into setup, that's what they mean, to go into the firmware onto the UEFI or the BIOS, and choose possibly USB as an option. Now in my case, it actually was kind of weird. It showed up as USB hard drive, and then down below it said USB Kingston blah blah blah. And at first I thought it was supposed to boot off of the Kingston option. That didn't work. So then I chose USB. It was calling it a USB hard drive in the boot options, and so I chose that one, and it was able to boot at that point. So anyway, I got Windows 10 installed, just kind of going through driver updates. But what I thought was interesting is when I went into the quote unquote BIOS, even though it's UEFI, this laptop is older, but it still has UEFI. It's been around for quite a while. And interestingly, Macs have been using UEFI for a long time. So Macintosh computers have been using the Universal, it stands for Universal Extensible Firmware Interface. So they've had that going for a long time. But when I booted this thing up and went into it, it referred to it as, you know, if you're downloading an update for the BIOS, it was calling it a BIOS update. It didn't say anything about UEFI on this laptop itself. You know, I could use the mouse in there. If you can use the mouse and it kind of has a nicer menu system, then you know that it's a UEFI BIOS. And in fact, here's a good screenshot in this article. And you can Google articles like this all day long. I can post this one if you want to, but basically if you just say UEFI versus BIOS, here you can see on my screen, if I'm sharing the right screen, I hope today, the one on the left is an old school BIOS. You know, you can see it's got this blue background, yellow text, and if you can see on the screen here, I'll try to make it a little bit bigger. It's about as big as it's going to get, I guess. The commands that you use in the old school BIOS are all on the keyboard. There's no mouse input on, I'll say on most of them. They did have a few of the older BIOSes that would recognize the mouse, but typically they don't. You would just be able to use the keyboard, the up and down arrow keys. You might hit tab to select something. You'd hit F10 on a lot of them to save your changes and exit, or you can hit escape and it'll ask you, do you want to save changes or not save changes? So if you guys are exploring the setup utility or BIOS on any of your computers, when you go to exit, unless you know that you want to save changes, don't just say, no, I don't want to save changes. And that's the safest thing to do. There's one more person waiting. Okay. I should designate some of you as co-hosts, then you can let people in on the waiting room so they can sit there. So the older BIOS functioned for a long, long time, and then they decided to start replacing it with a UEFI because the BIOS has a lot of limitations because of the amount of RAM that was allocated in the actual chips for the firmware. I mean, they kind of reached a point where they couldn't do some of the things the computer needed to do with the limitations of the traditional BIOS, basic input-output system. But if you are working on a computer and you go into the setup utility, Now they refer to it, if you can see on the screen, CMOS setup. And the CMOS is technically the, it stands for metal oxide semiconductor. The CMOS is actually the part of the BIOS that you can change, and that's actually a good point to bring. There's a good point, Dave. So in the BIOS, there's things that you can change, and there's things that you cannot change. Anything that is defined by the user, so boot order, boot sequence, setting the time and date in there. If a computer hasn't been used for a long time, it might not have the correct time and date in the BIOS or UEFI. So if there's a variable in there that you can change, that variable has to be maintained by an electrical signal. And did you guys know that there's a battery inside your computer on the motherboard? Some of you probably did, and others may not. So yes, there is a battery buried inside on the motherboard. If you look at pictures of motherboards in the book, they will show you a picture of what's called the CMOS battery. Now, typically when the computer is plugged in all the time, that little, it's just looks like a little button battery about the size of a quarter. Some of them do come in different shapes and sizes, but traditionally they are just a little button-shaped battery. I've got the lid off of a computer right now. I was going to try this again with focusing down in there. It was tough to do with this camera. It didn't want to focus that close. But the CMOS battery is what maintains power to the BIOS to maintain those system settings that are user definable. So it's important that although it's firmware, and the majority of the BIOS is all firmware, and you can't really, you can't change it. Well, you can change it by going through the process of updating the BIOS, because the chip that the BIOS is located on, and you guys can put this into your, is called an EEPROM. So it's electronically erasable, programmable, read-only memory. Now, if it's just a ROM chip, it's basically burned in at the factory and it cannot be changed. The EEPROMs have been around for quite a bit of time, and they allow the device to be updated. And they'll refer to this as flashing the BIOS, or updating the firmware, or flashing the firmware, something to that effect. And usually what that's involved is downloading a little program. The modern programs can do it. So like the BIOS on this laptop, it's like 5 years old, but it still is available to, you download the BIOS update, it executes while Windows is running, and it flashes the BIOS while the computer is booted up. On the older computers, you'd have to boot up off of a flash drive or a CD or DVD, and it would boot up with a flashing program, and then and then also on the disk would be the new BIOS information. So it'd have an image of the new BIOS information. So you boot up the computer, Windows isn't running, it flash updates the BIOS, and you can see it writing the information because it's electrically giving it a signal to erase the information that's on the BIOS chip, and then pushing the new information onto that chip. Now, they do warn you, if you're talking about upgrading your BIOS, that it could, if something goes drastically wrong, it could make your computer unbootable, right? So what happens if you're in the middle of, you've erased the BIOS and you're in the middle of writing new information to it, you're flashing it with some new information, and your cat steps on the switch for your power switch, your power strip, and the computer gets turned off. What do you think happens?
Interrupted.
Get a new cat. No. Go ahead.
I was going to say that it would get interrupted, or things would get corrupted.
Yeah, so I mean, it's one of those processes that most of the time it goes fine, but they do warn you that, we're talking about whether it's the UEFI or the BIOS, it's the thing that boots up your computer. You press the button, the motherboard has the BIOS on a chip on the motherboard. It's what starts up this boot up process to look for typically the hard drive, and then start the operating system. But if the BIOS is corrupted, your computer is no longer bootable, and there isn't a good way to fix it other than replacing the motherboard. Now, there are some places that will, reflash the BIOS and things like that, but for most of us mere mortals, if that actually happens, we would be looking at having to buy a new motherboard. some gaming motherboards, if you have a kind of a custom built computer that you've built and it's a gaming motherboard, they actually come with 2 BIOS chips and one is a backup, which actually is kind of a cool idea. So if you're wanting to play around with updating the BIOS or changing things in the BIOS that might be for overclocking and stuff like that, and you mess something up, you do have the option to boot off of your backup or secondary BIOS chip or UEFI, which actually is kind of a cool idea. Okay, so back to this. This is related to what we were talking about or what's in the, it comes in both books. So chapter 3 is your motherboard chapter in the hardware class. And in the other class, they were talking about partitioning the drive to get ready for installation. So there's 2 main styles of partitions and formatting for drives. And it's related to the BIOS because this is one of the things they ran into trouble with. Does anybody have a hard drive? I'm waving at the screen. Does anybody have a hard drive that's larger than 2 terabytes, like one single drive that's bigger than 2 terabytes? I don't see any hands going up or anything, but got a couple of screens here. All right, yell it, or you can put it in. You can put it in the chat if you want to. Usually there's at least somebody that's got, you know, a big old hard drive that's on their computer for data storage. And they're getting cheaper. So getting a 1 to 2 or 3 terabyte drive is not that expensive anymore. And most new computers will come with, you know, a 1 terabyte or larger drive. Now, if you're talking solid state drives, those are still more expensive than traditional hard drives. The traditional hard drives are still a better choice if you just need a giant drive for storing lots and lots of data. But one of the problems they ran into is that the older style BIOS would not support drives larger than 2 terabytes. So that was kind of one of these things. You had to have a newer style of formatting, which is partitioning called GPT, and you had to have something to support that as well. So these 2 things kind of go hand in hand. You have old school BIOS, which supports the traditional master boot record, which is talked about in the book and we'll discuss today. And then you have the newer UEFI style BIOS, which supports the GPT or GUID partition table, which can see much larger hard drives. And you all care about this because, well, if you're installing stuff or you buy a new hard drive and you have to make things work, this might come into play here. So, all right, so in this article here, it says the BIOS, it says, will soon be dead. Which when was this article? Oh, 2017, a few years ago. The BIOS is already pretty much dead, and it was pretty much dead at the time of the writing of this article, it says, as well. So it kind of goes into talking about what a BIOS is. I like the article because it shows you some nice screenshots of a traditional BIOS here. And if you boot up a computer and you go into the setup and you try to make, you're looking at it and it looks like this, that's a good indication that the computer is a little bit older. Because even the computers we have in the classroom that are the 2nd generation, not the new ones we just got, but the ones that were the previous generation, they still had a UEFI style BIOS. You could use the mouse in it and stuff like that. Now, the screenshot that they show here, this one is from an Asus, it says, and it's okay looking. One of our computers that we have in class is a gaming computer, and if you go into the setup for that, you go into the UEFI, it's got like this picture of like a rocket ship thing across the top. It's a Republic of Gamers. I forget anyway, it's got cool graphics and it does, you know, you can monitor temperature settings. There's a lot of information that you can get. And actually the BIOS itself on that one, the UEFI, has the capability to get online and you can actually do updates without even going into Windows. You can do a BIOS update or a UEFI update from right inside of that, that setup, which is kind of cool as well. Okay, so UEFI is the new school, newer stuff. It's probably what you're going to be seeing from here on out. The basic thing is if you see something that looks like this and it's giving you a menu system, which is using arrow keys and stuff like that, that's older. It's not that it's not something that would be useful for playing with. It could be a good server, or maybe you're working on a server itself and it looks like this. So it isn't that you're not going to see it anymore, but it's going to be increasingly uncommon. Okay, so let's see here. From your books, to get back to where we're at here, from your books, the reason this becomes an issue is that if you're trying to install a computer, there's times when you might need to put it into legacy mode. And the legacy mode is part of the BIOS as well, because it allows the computer to boot up with a master boot record. And there might be times that if you have a hard drive that's say 3 terabytes, you can still use the older style of partitioning, but you'd have to chop the drive up into 2 pieces that are smaller than 2 terabytes each. Does that make sense? Okay, so you would partition it, you'd create a partition in the drive itself, so you had 2 logical drives that were, 1.5 terabytes or so if you had a 3 terabyte drive. Here I'm talking with my hands a lot, so because you all can see me because you're watching my screen, although we've got a little window here that, and I have 2 monitors so I can kind of see what's going on, but it's still goofy. Yeah, you guys are laughing at me. Okay, it's all good. All right, so if we're looking at the screen over here, and you guys are looking at the screen, it says MBR or GPT partitioning system. Now these 2 are related. It's the GUID partition table. It says you need to be aware of the partitioning method you will use on the hard drive. By default, on newer computers, it's going to be GPT. Unless you do something different, like choose to use legacy mode, which you might if you're installing Linux or something to the laptop, you might be forced to use legacy mode. Most of the Linux distributions will now use GPT. You may have to turn off secure boot. So if you see secure boot mentioned in the article or online, or if you're reading some help menu, secure boot is a function of the operating system. And originally it was only a Microsoft thing. And then there was kind of an uproar about it, and they allowed the secure boot to be turned off in the BIOS. At first, it was going to be locked in, and then all the Linux people were like, hey, that's not fair. You've got something in the BIOS or in the UEFI on a computer that's going to make it really difficult for Linux users. So it can be turned off. You can turn off secure boot, and most of the Linux distributions now will accommodate secure boot. I turn it off on the BIOS on a lot of the things I'm working with, because I don't care about it that much. And then if I want to install Linux, it just makes it easier. Okay, master boot record. You've got a hard drive. Here, I've got my fancy collection of hard drives, you can see. So here is standard desktop full height hard drive. It's about 1 inch thick. It's got the good old SATA connections on the back, which are a little bit different to see because there they are. So you've got SATA connections. This one happens to have, well, actually, no, it doesn't, sorry. So it's got the SATA connections. One of those is for data. It's the little one right here. And then the bigger one is for power. Got a smaller laptop hard drive. This is also mechanical. SSDs are made in this shape and configuration as well to be able to be easily mounted as a replacement in a laptop. And as we mentioned, the solid state drives can also take the form of what looks like a RAM stick for the M.2 format. And this just mounts in flat on the motherboard and is held in with a set screw. And now I've got this one too. So there are other types of hard drives that are out there that are just not very common. This one came out of an Apple iPod. If you guys remember, before everybody had streaming music, people carried around iPods, and some of them had little hard drives in them. Some of them had RAM or memory. This one is a 160 gigabyte, oh no, excuse me, this one's 30 gigabytes, a 30 gigabyte Apple hard drive. Kind of interesting, unique thing, because it's a weird size, like you care. All right, so the master boot record, we're going to use the board today. If you've got a hard drive.
Hey Dave, can we switch off of screen share so we can see?
Yes, thank you. Yes, thank you. That's what I need. I need technical assistance here. All right. Where is my? I've lost my toolbar there. All right, there it is. Okay, hopefully you can see that at this point. Sorry about that. Technical difficulties. All right, so this is a hard drive. Yeah, right. So under the master boot record, so if you were, so the hard drive has sectors and tracks. Now you can't see them, but you've got sectors going out like this. And you have tracks that are like circular pathways. So A hard drive, when it's traditionally organized, how many of you have ever played Battleship, where it's like G9 or whatever, you know the concept, right? Sectors and tracks gives you the ability to isolate certain areas of the drive where data would be stored. And the outer perimeter of the drive is spinning, well, the whole drive is spinning at a certain RPM. It might be 5,400 RPMs, it might be 7,200, or it might be something like 10,000 or even 15,000 RPMs on some server drives that are real high performance. The typical drive is spinning at 7,200 RPMs roughly. So what that means is that the outer tracks are going to have a greater linear speed than the inner tracks. So you get better performance on the outside, but that's not really a huge issue. So you have sectors and tracks that are organizing the drive. With the traditional master boot record, the master boot record is stored on the boot sector of the drive, and it will tell the computer how the drive is organized. So in some cases, and then again, I'm going to get rid of this. So I'm just going to picture this. It's not really divided up like a pie, but with a traditional master boot record type partitioning, I could have four partitions, and that's it. Now each drive, if I have, if this is a C drive, and then I also have, a D or E or whatever. So if I have 2 physical drives in the computer, they can each have 4 partitions. So that worked out pretty well for a long, long time, because most people didn't really need more than 1 partition. On most computers, you would just have, one big C drive, right? If you might have a hidden system partition that might be used for recovery and things like that, but you might not see that unless you went into disk management and looked at the drive closely, and you can see some hidden and system partitions that are set up by the operating system in order to boot up the computer. But for many people, having just one big partition and maybe a smaller reserve system partition for recovery, that's all they want. They've got one big drive to store stuff on, everything's on the C drive, not a big deal. But what they found is as the drives got bigger than 2 terabytes, you had to have so with these traditional partitioning, you have 4 available partitions if you want to be able to use them, and one of them is your active system partition. So that's where the operating system is going to be, and it's going to boot up the computer. Now you can have more than one operating system on these partitions, and they call that dual boot or triple boot or quadruple boot. And when you do that, then what loads up instead of the operating system is your bootloader. So the bootloader will actually be stored in the master boot record, and it's going to execute, and you'll get a choice. You'll say, oh, do you want to boot up Windows 10? Do you want to boot up server? Or if you're running a Linux system, they have their own bootloader, and it'll boot up, and they'll say, do you want to boot up Linux or do you want to boot up Windows? And then once you go into Windows, then it sort of takes over and does its thing. So the system partition is important. The bootloader is important. If you're running a newer operating system and newer computer, it is probably formatted with or partitioned with GPT. So one person says they only have a 2 terabyte, probably going to upgrade to 4 terabyte. And like I said, at this point, you're probably running a GPT style partitioning scheme. So if you're looking in the book, they're talking about GPT here, and they do a pretty good explanation of it. And you can look up, UEFI versus MBR. You can look up GPT versus MBR. UEFI versus BIOS, or GPT versus MBR. And these two go together. So if you're running a GPT style partition, you automatically have to have a UEFI BIOS, right? So those two are related in terms of technology and the need of one for the other. Okay, so if you have GPT, you can have larger than 2 terabytes as one big chunk. So again, you guys that have a C drive and maybe you got a 4 terabyte drive, you could theoretically have, one big partition along with the hidden system partitions. So you could have one big partition that was almost 4 terabytes. So Windows would just have this massive space, to store stuff. Now, and I don't see a real huge reason for creating multiple partitions unless you want to have multiple operating systems. That way you could have 2 operating systems and each would have a discrete space, because you're still talking about one physical drive. If you were trying to back up data, backing it up from one partition to another doesn't gain you anything, right? Because one physical drive can still fail and you'd lose your data. Now, if I have a second physical drive in the computer, I can copy data from one to the next and back it up between 2 physical drives, and that helps secure data. Now, if you get a virus on the system, it could potentially infect both hard drives. You know, that's sort of another issue that we'll get into. But so at any rate,
So
the terminal. Go ahead. Go ahead.
is the hidden system partitions why like a 1 terabyte only says 930 gigabytes?
No, but that's a great, well, partially, yes, partially it is, but also it's because the drive manufacturers will use, I'm trying to remember which way it is, but the operating system will use, so a definition of a gigabyte is roughly 1,000 megabytes, right? But what happens is one of them, and I'm trying to remember which one it is, one of them measures it at the actual binary level, so it's 1,024 megabytes, and then one of them rounds it off at 1,000. So when you actually go to format it, it's going to look different. So the drive manufacturer will say it's 2 terabytes, but when you actually format it out, it'll format it out at like, you know, 1.8 gigabytes or something like that, or 1.9. But that's a good question, because the two, it would be nice if there was consistency there, but there's not. One measures it at 1024, and I'll look up which one's which. And then one measures it at 1,000 megabytes equals a terabyte, or 1,000 gigabytes, excuse me, measures it as a terabyte. Does that help at all? So
Yeah.
it's a number, it's a math thing, and you would think they would be consistent, but it is not consistent between hard drive manufacturers versus formatting it out with the OS. Which actually is a good question, because it comes back to right here when it's talking about the partitions. So the master boot record or GPT, those are the way the hard drives are actually organized, and you know how the partitions are created. You can think of the partitions as being, you know, an empty room, and then once the empty room is created, you have to have a way of finding stuff in that empty room, or a file cabinet. You know, there's different ways of organizing a file cabinet. Some people just throw everything in there. Some people are very organized and they've got, you know, taxes and whatever. So MBR or GPT is how the room is set up, and then you've got your formatting system, which is typically NTFS. So the book's talking about New Technology File System is what that stands for, and that's the formatting method for traditional hard drives with Windows. It's not universal. Okay, so different things use different formatting. Linux has their own formatting called ext3 or 4 or 5, depending on the version of it. Is anybody a Mac user? What does OS X use for its formatting for hard drives? I guess we can Google it, but Macs use their own stuff, right? So they'll use hard drives that are physically identical, but it will be, you know, set up and formatted for use in, well, Linux or a Mac or whatever. So the hardware has become somewhat standardized. Apple computers use Intel processors. They use RAM that's very similar. They use video cards if they have them that are very similar. So the hardware is kind of standardized, but how the operating system is set up is a little bit different. Okay, so a volume, it says, is once it's been formatted and it's assigned a drive letter, then it's called a volume. And so you can have multiple logical drives or logical volumes on a computer. Here it's talking about the UEFI or BIOS firmware, which we were just talking about, so we don't need to spend too much time on that. But that is located on an actual chip on the motherboard, and usually you can find it pretty well because it is located near the battery. So here's a great picture in the book of the CMOS battery. Now the CMOS battery, like I said, is maintaining settings in the BIOS or the firmware that are user definable. If that battery is pulled out, then those settings are lost. Now sometimes they will be maintained for a little bit of time until the electricity dissipates from capacitors. So one of the other things that's stored on your BIOS is a password. Do any of you have a supervisor or administrative password configured for security on your computer in the BIOS or in the UEFI? No? Okay. It's not uncommon. So from an IT perspective, this is not in the book, but this is good information. if you are working, like let's say here on campus, one of the things they do when they bring computers and set them up, now not in my lab because I told them not to do it, but in normal computer labs, what they will do is they'll go in and they'll set the boot order so that it boots to the hard drive first, right? It won't even look at USBs, any of that kind of stuff. And they'll set a password in the BIOS. And I'm going to keep saying BIOS, but in your heads think, oh, he actually means a UEFI these days, right? Because that's what, and I think it's funny, even on, like, say on my laptop, they call it a BIOS. Inside the UEFI, they still call it a BIOS. So you set a password on it that says, in order to change any settings in here, you have to type in an administrative password. You can also set a boot level password for extra security, but that you wouldn't do that in a computer lab because you're not going to give out the password to everybody to log in to the BIOS that will then allow it to see the operating system. But so passwords are user definable as well. So if you ever get a computer from, an auction or something, and you go in to change something in it, and it's asking you for a password, one way you could do it is to take the battery out. Now, we have had some difficulty in clearing passwords simply by taking the battery out. We'll wait for a period of time. There's a capacitor being shown in the picture right there. So even though we took the battery out, it maintained the password for quite a long time. So the other option is, you see these, that's a pretty small picture there. Let's see if you got. So you can see these blue jumpers right here. And a jumper is basically, a jumper is 2 little wires that stick out of the motherboard, or 3 or 4. And then there's what looks like it's plastic, but inside there's metal. And it's just the most basic switch you can imagine. If you can imagine taking a jumper wire and connecting 2 wires together, that's what a jumper is doing. So when you switch the light switch on, all you're doing is connecting 2 wires inside the switch. That's what a jumper does on the motherboard. So one of the other things you guys could look at on your computer, and jumpers are hardly ever used anymore. They used to be used on motherboards for all sorts of stuff. Now, one of the only jumpers you're going to see, and it'll usually say reset next to it, or CMOS or something like that, printed in small letters. It's probably going to be blue, and it'll be near the battery. And what that allows you to do is resets the CMOS completely, and you don't have to take the battery out or whatever. Usually there's some instructions that you might want to be following. So the general instruction is to power the computer down. And again, this comes up for security reasons, or if you're working on a system. Now, this is really difficult to do on laptops. So how many people have laptops? Be very, very careful if you set a password in the BIOS that you remember what that password is. Because if you set a security password in the BIOS, in the UEFI on a laptop, and you can't remember what it is, you could be in deep trouble. You won't be able to get in and make those changes and do the things you want to do, like if you wanted to reinstall, for instance, or something like that. That can be trouble. There's some little like hacking tricks on the internet for certain computers where you can enter in a secret code, but they're not very reliable. So my experience is with a laptop, some of them have batteries that you can get to if you dig deep enough into the laptop, but a lot of them do not have a replaceable battery like that. They'll have a battery that's soldered into the motherboard, so it's not user replaceable. So long story short, be really careful with passwords on things like a UEFI or BIOS, but be aware if it's a desktop computer that you can unplug it, push the power button to dissipate any remaining electricity. You would move the jumper to the other position. So sometimes there might be 3 pins, and you'd be moving it from pins 1 and 2 to pins 2 and 3. In some cases, you're just removing the jumper completely, powering up the computer again. So you're powering it up so that the jumper is in a different position. That resets the information that's being stored in the firmware that's being maintained by the battery. So it'll reset the clock, it'll reset all this stuff, but the important one is the password. That's usually what people are doing this for, is that somebody has put a password on the BIOS, on the UEFI. This happens in class. We'll be playing around with this stuff, and somebody in the classroom will set a password, and then next quarter we go in to make changes to the BIOS, and they're like, hey, Dave, we got a password on this one. Well, sometimes it's password 1, like the classroom, we pick that one a lot, right? Other times we have to get in and change that. If you guys can see my screen, you might be changing that jumper. You'd remove it, power it down, be safe, change the jumper or pull the jumper, power the computer back up, then you shut it down again, unplugging it, being safe that way, put the jumper back on where you found it, and then the password should be magically gone. You go back in the BIOS and everything's set to default settings. So that can actually be really handy to be able to do that. Okay, so this part of the, I'm going to let this, you guys can look at this and see that, you know, the difference between the idea with UEFI versus traditional BIOS, keeping in mind that almost everything you're going to see these days is UEFI, so maybe focusing on more on that kind of stuff. And here, you know, they're showing it as being UEFI/BIOS. You know, that's just going to be the terminology. It's not going to be, it's probably going to become standardized that people will just keep calling it, you know, a BIOS, and we'll just understand that it's UEFI. Okay, so the secure boot thing is what I was talking about too. That's an important concept, is knowing what secure boot is. It can be turned off, and in fact, a lot of times you would be turning it off if you were installing Linux to the computer. Okay, so we'll stop that share at this point. I posted another assignment for, so one of these classes has a quiz coming up, right? Okay, so that's this book. So one has a quiz, and then the other class has a quick assignment where you are posting a screenshot. So the other, in the 9 o'clock section, we talked about this. I'm trying to figure out a way to basically see if students are doing the exercises at home. I know some of you are pressed for time, but the hands-on part is really important. And, you know, in class, that's what we would do in class sometimes, is, you know, I might lecture for 15, 20 minutes, or we'd kind of lay out what we were going to do for today, and then we would work on the hands-on project. With the Zoom thing, I'm finding myself talking more at during each session, like talking more, but knowing that we're only doing this 3 days a week. So it's kind of like there's still information that I want to tell you guys, but we've only got Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. So Thursdays and Fridays are days that maybe you guys can find time in your schedule. I know I see cats in the Zoom, we got kids at home, and dogs, whatever. I mean, I'm in the same boat. That's why it's nice to come in here to school, because at home there's so many distractions too. Like if my wife is home, she might be doing a Zoom call for work. I've got the dog bugging me all the time because he's spoiled now because I'm home all the time. He thinks I should play with him 24/7. So anyway, I get it. I get that it's hard to do this kind of stuff, but try to find time to do these activities, and it shouldn't take that much time if it goes okay. So the idea is to the assignment for you guys is simply to learn how to screenshot and how to upload it to Canvas. I had you guys maybe using ipconfig or showing that you're doing something, and it is even an assignment like the 9 o'clock class. And oh, okay, good. Yeah, if you guys have questions, I'm happy to help you on the weekends or Thursday, Friday. So send it out to Discord. I've usually got my phone with me, and my wife will be like, "Who are you talking to?" And I'm like, "A student." She's like, "You're not talking to a student. It's Saturday." And I'm like, "Well, yeah, they have a question about it, you know, whatever it is." So I don't mind at all. If I'm busy or I'm out of cell phone range, you might not get a response. But maybe if you post it if you message me directly, other people don't see it. But if you post it in the discussion forum for the class, you might get some other students helping you out too, which is nice. So I had something else for us today, and I'm trying to see what was on my screens, multiple screens. Okay, so yeah, here's another good quick, and I'll post these links too. You guys can find the same stuff. I mean, I'm not doing anything magic in Google. It's basically UEFI versus BIOS, or MBR versus GPT, and you might get a little more information than what the book is providing. So, so this is another quick article where it's just talking about the differences between UEFI, and here's a good, you know, question and answer. Sometimes you'll find these in discussion forums. I search Reddit sometimes a lot. I mean, Reddit's got a lot of goofy stuff on it, but it also has a lot of sub forums for people using, you know, Linux or Windows or whatever. There's a lot of knowledgeable people that'll post stuff on Reddit. So this is asking, what's the difference between UEFI and the BIOS? BIOS and UEFI are two firmware interfaces for computers to start the operating system. The BIOS uses the master boot record, which we were talking about, to save information about the hard drive data, while UEFI uses the GUID partition table, GUID. And it says, compared with the BIOS, UEFI is more powerful and has more advanced features. It is the latest method of booting a computer. and people are saying, should I use UEFI? Now, you don't really have a choice of which one to use. Your motherboard will come with one or the other. Now, what they might be asking is, should I use MBR or should I use GPT? It might be if you want to set up a formatting specifically. Now, a lot of operating systems these days won't give you the choice. If you install Windows and you're installing it to a UEFI system, if you haven't selected legacy mode, it's going to automatically make a GPT partition. What you'll see this come up with is Rufus, that program we were talking about with Rufus. You have an option sometimes to choose a GPT style or MBR. So sometimes if you're making a little boot disk and you're trying to boot it up, you might try making one that's an MBR format, and then the computer will boot up off of it easier. Anyway, but in general, these days, if you have a choice, I would try GPT first. You know, it's only when you're trying weird old operating systems or certain versions of Linux that you might have to tell the system to boot into legacy mode and install it in legacy mode. And this kind of goes through and it talks a little bit more about that. So this is a pretty good quick summary of it. And UEFI tends to boot up more quickly as well. So the changes in systems. One other one that's kind of interesting is if you're running a solid state drive and the UEFI is set to quick boot mode, sometimes it boots up so fast that you don't have the option to hit a key to get into setup. Has anybody run into that at all? Maybe. And one of our gaming computers here has a little utility that you install, and you can also do this on your through Windows too. You can tell Windows the next time it boots up to go into setup mode. But at any rate, they're booting up so quickly because of the combination of a solid state drive and the newer UEFI is that you don't have a chance to hit F12 or delete or escape on the keyboard. And that might come up for you guys too on certain computers. You'll have to find the workaround or let it boot up into Windows and then try to get into your setup menu, which could be difficult if Windows isn't loading, but it also is supposed to have a failback where if Windows doesn't boot up correctly 3 times in a row, it automatically goes into your setup menu. So if you ever have some problems with a computer and it's not booting correctly, that's something we'll discuss as well. We'll save that for another day. If you want to Google it, is how to boot Windows 10 in safe mode. That'd be another discussion for another day. We're out of time today. I feel like I've talked a lot, but I feel like there's a lot of information I want to get across, but sometimes we're just a little limited. So Windows 10 safe mode is, a diagnostics menu. You guys might have seen it on older versions of Windows where you'd hit F8 repeatedly and it would come up with this menu system to go in and do diagnostics. And Ibrahim's saying, everybody update your NVIDIA drivers. Yeah, so NVIDIA is nice, they have good driver support. Also, I saw in the news the other day that NVIDIA is building the world's fastest supercomputer in Britain. I thought that was interesting. Usually you hear about IBM or somebody doing it, but NVIDIA, which obviously makes graphics cards, has gotten really good at making super fast graphics processing units, and that must be carrying over into their ability to build supercomputers. So they're I don't know. I just thought that was interesting that it was NVIDIA and not like Microsoft or IBM or somebody. It was what we normally think of as a video card manufacturer. All right, so yeah, chat menu is telling everybody to update your NVIDIA drivers. That's awesome. I might do the same thing on I have one that's in AMD and one that's in NVIDIA, so nice, good information. Although I'm not hardly gaming anymore, so it doesn't make as big a difference for drivers. So, all right, about ready to sign off for today. Again, check Canvas, do your test. Take the screenshot and upload the file. If you have problems with that, please let me know. This is sort of an experiment to see if there's a good way for you guys to show me what you're working on at home and not have to go through. And the other option would be to have everybody share their screen live in Zoom, but we'd spend the whole class period with people trying to share their screens. And we still can do some of that. If you guys are having a problem at home and you want to do some troubleshooting, we can get the whole class to try to help out. You might be able to share your screen and see what's going on your home computer. That would be a good option as well. But otherwise, this is a good way for me to see that you're doing something at home and not just goofing off, which goofing off is okay too. Nice weather for the next couple of days. Hope you guys have a great long weekend. Stay in touch on Thursday and Friday if you need help, and we'll meet back on Monday. Sound good?
All right.
All
man.
right.
See you later.
Good.
Thanks, guys. All right, guys and gals. All right, thank you.